about a little over 6 months ago at last AWS reInvent when we presented our Nirmata to the attendees there. There was a lot of interest, we got a lot of feedback around the ease of use, the simplicity. But there was also a recurring request, which was, how can we get Nirmata experience, the ease of use on Kubernetes? And that kind of got us thinking in terms of how do we really look at Kubernetes and how do we play with Kubernetes? Is it a competitive platform and they do Kubernetes focuses on container management? We have our own scheduler which does container management, or is it something that is it complementary? As we dug deeper, we realized that Kubernetes has evolved as a tool set, if you will, to build higher level systems on top of. Obviously, Kubernetes has a lot of mindshare. The community is vibrant, growing, probably the fastest growing project out there. But along with that comes complexity, especially when it comes to developers. So Kubernetes, if you're familiar with it, provides a lot of interesting constructs for sysadmins or operations folks. But from a developer standpoint, it's something new to learn, in terms of new concepts, new constructs, and really while Docker gained initial popularity because of the ease of use, Kubernetes has not so far done a great job of that initial user experience or even an ongoing user experience. So if you double click into Kubernetes and set of constructs, and this is just like 10-15% of the concepts that Kubernetes exposes, it really kind of, as a developer, you start wondering, like, if I want to build my application, what do I need? Where do I start? Do I need a bunch of pods, or do I need to define services or deployments? What's a stateful set, and when do I need a daemon set? There's a lot of new concepts and constructs to learn, and which is very powerful, but it's also very daunting for a lot of folks out there. So at Nirmata, we kind of are taking the ease of use, the layers that Jim described in terms of the cluster, the host management, as well as the application delivery, and extending that to Kubernetes. So again, from a host management perspective, all of our integrations into cloud providers in terms of provisioning host instances based on application needs, and then automating the cluster management. And these two steps in Nirmata have always been optional. So it's like you can provision your instances, provision your cluster outside of Nirmata, and bring it in, or use Nirmata to help do that. The top layer is where most of our value, most of our focus is around application delivery and management, and that's what we'll get into more. So we'll start with the demo, and I'll focus on initial operations use cases, and then Jim's going to focus on the application side of things. So the first part of the demo I'll show how you can provision or onboard instances into Nirmata from cloud providers, and then followed by what it takes to kind of deploy a Kubernetes cluster in Nirmata.
So from the Kubernetes thing, you still being the scheduler, but using Kubernetes underneath?
Right.
And so you managing Kubernetes?
We would use Kubernetes as the container manager and the container scheduler. What Nirmata would do is focus on the higher level orchestration workflows. Say, for example, if a host needs to be set up, or if storage needs to be provisioned before it's applied to a pod, things to that nature.
So you orchestrate the orchestrators?
Yes. So if
It would have been easy to say that at the start.
We orchestrate applications, entire applications on these orchestrators, however you want to look at it.
So it's both. It's the orchestrator as well as the application.
How do you define an application?
So let's look at that live, and we'll show how we're modeling an application. So the simple definition is a set of services. It's a set of containers, but there's properties that we would build into Nirmata for that.
So when you use the term application, that's your own definition, like it's a specific definition of something or a cluster of components within the application, or you're generically using the term application as a service or application that the customer would use.
So users would model their applications, and we are not imposing whether it's stateful, whether it's stateless, whether it's 3-tier, whether it's microservices. It's completely up to the developers and the teams that are using it. But to us, an application is a collection of different components. So it is a term, it's a construct in Nirmata, but it's not something that we're imposing in terms of a single definition of an application.
I mean, that's obviously fair. Every application is going to be different. But an application, say it's, for example, going to be 10 containers and 5 of them are going to be, 2 of them are going to be a payment gateway, 2 of them is going to be a website, 2 of them is going to read and write to a database. How does Nirmata, it would probably be good to see just how Nirmata shows an app.
So let's start with the demo. So just quick in terms of, from an operational perspective, so Nirmata, as you probably know, for containers, you need image registries. So Nirmata integrates with several of these image registries out there, and basically that kind of is required in order to be able to pull down images, for the applications. The next level, in terms of an operation standpoint, first thing you do is onboard your cloud providers. So as discussed earlier, we support most of the major cloud providers out there, and for each cloud provider, obviously the integration involves plugging into their IAM APIs to kind of get access to some resources in the customer's accounts. So we use the best practices, provided by the cloud provider. So in case of AWS, it's the IAM policy. In case of Azure, it's different, keys and so on. So once these cloud providers are set up, really the next kind of thing, next step from an operational standpoint is to onboard your cloud resources. So we kind of enable or allow operations teams to group these resources in what we call host groups. You can easily add additional host groups, and this is where we integrate into, again, native cloud provider constructs. So on AWS, AWS has a lot of different ways you can spin up instances. It's, you can have on-demand instances, Spot instances, autoscale groups, and we integrate with those APIs, allowing customers to use or spin up those, define those resources so that either they can be, Nirmata can spin them up, or if they're using autoscale or Spot, AWS spins them up. And they basically connect back to Nirmata. So if you see this host group, we have an instance here. It's an AWS on-demand instance, which is available for provisioning your application. And then we also have a few set of host groups on Azure. So you can group these and add more based on the cloud providers you're trying to use.
Do you have to manage those at the host level, or can you use things like Amazon's container service?
So we are doing the scheduling and operations of containers. So it would be an either or. We don't integrate into ACS at this point.
Okay.
We also, like I mentioned earlier, we also have this concept of direct connect. So some of our customers have their own cloud management, systems that they use to provision their instances. So with a template, with a Nirmata template, they can provision those instances. All it needs is Docker and our agent that is installed, right? So and it connects back, and that in that case, the management of the host is happening outside of Nirmata.
So do you provide anything to manage those hosts, like updates, patches?
No.
Okay.
So we provide, our focus is, for us, the host is just the set of resources that are used to deliver and deploy applications on. There's already existing tools and products out there that do a lot of that, whether it's Chef, Puppet, or Ansible, or other tools that they would use.
Do you integrate with any of those?
Yes. So we have extensive APIs. So one of our customers, already an AWS user, they're using our APIs to know when the hosts are provisioned, and then deploying Chef and other basically other tools they need on the host, for security and other reasons, as well as Docker and Nirmata AD. So they do the provisioning of the host out of band, through the APIs.
Right.
So that's how integration happens typically. So one of the new concepts we are introducing as we support Kubernetes is this concept of clusters. And clusters is a collection of host groups. This allows a lot of flexibility in terms of combining maybe on-demand instances, let's say Spot instances, into a cluster. Potentially gives flexibility in terms of defining cluster for deploying your applications, especially on top of something like Kubernetes. So we'll dig deeper into that. And then from an operational standpoint, the final thing I want to quickly mention is the policies that we allow administrators or operations folks to set up. And this is what decouples the application from the infrastructure. So you can define what we call environment types, whether it's your dev, test, production. This is really a template for things like what kind of images go into which environment, which registry is used, how application updates are handled, as well as access control in terms of who has access to what environment. So if you may restrict access to production environments and allow developers to access non-production environments.
I want to go back to the clusters view just for a second, because I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between a host group and a cluster.
Yeah. So host group is say, think of it as a template for your cloud instances, right? So you may have a host group for AWS Spot instances. You may have a host group for AWS Autoscale instances, or you may have a host group for AWS on-demand instances of a particular type, let's say C3 or so on. Now, a cluster through a cluster you can combine all of these, and a cluster is more for when we talk about from a Kubernetes standpoint, right? So it's a Kubernetes cluster. It uses all of these hosts for your application, and that's where you can combine a set of disparate resources. I mean, you could even span like a cluster across on-prem and cloud. That's not like a very common use case, but host group construct allows that, and gives you that flexibility.
So one advantage and one way we have seen that used today is there would be one with static host group, which is pre-sized and fixed, but then using something like Spot instances, you can have an elastic host group. So then Nirmata can automatically balance your application and maintain your SLAs across that. So if Spot resources, market price resources are available, those would be consumed first. Otherwise, we would spin up the more expensive, the more static resources, right? So it's those kind of scenarios why we have kind of had that separation.
You basically have two different tiers of hosts, and then you cluster across both of those.
Exactly.
Potentially, yes. That's what. I mean, you may in a lot of cases there may be just a 1:1 mapping between cluster and host group, which is completely fine. But this allows for that flexibility in case it's needed.
Do you mind if we just go to the applications tab? I'm still missing the point of what the applications look like, because obviously you can manage across clusters, across clouds, and their policies and all that kind of thing, but without seeing the apps, so I'm missing a piece.
I guess, in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is maybe quickly show one simple.
So let's go to apps and see that first, Ritesh.
Okay. So in terms of applications, let's go to that. So this is an application. What the application screen looks like in terms of this. Essentially, these are separate applications, completely kind of self-sufficient in terms of the definition, right? So these are basically what we call application blueprints. And in a blueprint, you would specify like this is a simple like a demo application. If you're familiar with Pet Clinic, it's a Java-based application backed by MySQL, right? So it's two components. And for each component, you specify all the requirements in terms of what commands need to be run, what are the networking requirements.
When you say components, is that then at a minimum 2 containers? Although that
Yes.
pet, so the MySQL can be a cluster of MySQL containers, and then the
Correct.
pet clinic itself can be then a cluster of web servers.
Exactly.
Which can independently scale. Okay.
So this is just a definition. So when you actually deploy this application, that's when you would define whether you need one instance of a particular component or you need multiple.
Okay, so for an example, if you were pretend to be architecting a 3-tier application, you would see 3
Yes.
components,
Yes.
but those 3 components can then scale independently
Yes.
each part.
Exactly.
Okay, and is that then defined within the Nirmata system that you,
Yes.
and it can scale up and down based on, I don't know, I/O or use
Yes.
or whatever?
That's correct.
Okay.
So yeah, you would define there's each definition for each component, but there are some common things you can define in terms of environment, variables, routes, affinity, scaling, and this you could define this per environment type. So in dev test, you may want different scaling. You may just want one instance. In production, you may want multiple instances, and so.
So then in that application definition, for example, you have your pet clinic application needs to talk to the database. Is then Nirmata going to set up all of the container networking to connect to that?
Yes.
Then the MySQL database obviously needs to store something on persistent storage. Is then Nirmata going to provision that Docker volume driver or whatever
That's
on the...
correct.
Okay, so it's sort of an orchestration. You build up your applications, your database needs to have persistent storage, your app
Right.
needs to talk via the network, and Nirmata is going to orchestrate that.
That's correct.
The connectivity of the storage and the networking across multiple
Yes.
clouds and be SaaS managed.
Yes.
Martin allows you to set up a policy describing what an application is, and then as the orchestrator of all the different platforms to distribute that across wherever.
Exactly. So if with our own orchestration, kind of we set everything up, but now with Kubernetes, through policies, we are translating that into a Kubernetes construct. So networking means completely different if you're orchestrating on Docker Swarm or if you're orchestrating on Kubernetes, right? And that's comes together through Nirmata policy.
So you provide an abstraction layer that somebody could, for example, be running a Kubernetes cluster on, say, Google Compute. They could be running Docker Swarm on premises.
Right.
But if you choose to deploy an application that spans both, Nirmata is going to hand over to Docker Swarm for it to do its networking, and then hand over to Kubernetes in the other environment to do its networking.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this comes together through constructs like the network policy. In this case, we have 2 policies. Conti, which is a Cisco-based network plugin for Kubernetes as well as Docker, and Calico, which is again another networking.
So is it abstracted in enough that the operational benefits for an IT team would be that you don't then have to know Kubernetes networking super well, and you don't have to know Docker Swarm networking super well, for example. You just need to know the Nirmata stuff, and the Kubernetes is just going to happen on that cloud, and Docker is going to happen on that cloud.
2 roles here again, which are important, right? So the ops team, I would say, does need to know, or at least does need to be aware
Have an
of what's
appreciation of
possible,
it.
right? And they're the ones setting up the policy. So they're saying, in this Kubernetes cluster, I want Calico, and I want microsegmentation based on that. So I'm going to define that as a policy. The app team doesn't need to know that. As a developer, I don't care. I need a port for my app. I need my Tomcat service to talk on port 80. That's all I care about. I don't even really need to know or care about whether my app lands on Azure or AWS or Kubernetes. Really, to me, just get my application running.
Okay, so was that the distinction you were making about when we started this? You were talking about the dev and the ops having different rules.
Yes.
This is the way that the ops is obviously going to do all the plumbing. Nirmata is going to handle all of that. But from an operational point of view, that a developer creates an application blueprint in a single place, and regardless of what cloud it runs on, it's going to look the same to the developer.
Exactly.
So a MySQL, an application with the pet web server and a database server looks the same to a developer, but operationally it could be all on different clouds.
So the assumption here is then this is more aimed at operations. This is not aimed at development, right? It assumes the artifacts are already available.
Correct. So, and operations, I think there's a little bit distinction to be made there. So there's infrastructure operations, there's security operations, and then there is application operations. So really, a lot of the stuff we do is on the application operations side. And we're seeing that distinction in companies, right? There are experts in each of these areas, and our focus tends to be application operations.
I think that's a really confusing point you just made that would do well to kind of articulate better as to who that is targeted toward, who your solution is targeted toward and what the problem is they're trying to serve. Because it seems like we've gone through a lot of discussion, over the last, whatever it's been, 30 minutes or so, kind of getting to this point. And I think we're finally getting into understanding what you do and who the product is tiered towards. So just some feedback. That would be really helpful to kind of tee up on the top end.
Okay.
And then it helps put it in the right context of understanding, okay, now what are the questions that I have around that? And what are the problems I'm trying to solve around that?
Okay.
So just something to think about as you go through the rest of the presentation is kind of to focus on those pieces.
Okay. So yeah, this is, so in just digging deeper into the application blueprint. So this is another application blueprint as an example of a more complex, let's say a microservices style application with several different components. And orchestrating this, managing this, making sure this application stays up and running is what Nirmata helps with.